So, South Africa returning to the United Nations Security Council for the third time in an election in New York. We won with an overwhelming majority to be granted a 2-year non-permanent post on the now 15-member council.
Yeah, definitely. It is the third time South Africa has sat on the world's premier body of peace and security in 12 years. Nick Harper reports from New York.
South Africa, 183.
Foregone conclusion, but still reason to celebrate. The result was expected. It was more a case of how many votes South Africa would get. Out of the 190 UN members voting, it achieved 183, well clear of the two-thirds majority required to win the seat.
The meeting is adjourned.
Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Lindiwe Sisulu, was at the UN for the election.
We are honored and humbled with this gesture and confidence. Our tenure at the Security Council will be dedicated to the legacy of Nelson Mandela, our icon, and his commitment to peace. South Africa will use this particular tenure in the Security Council to promote the maintenance of international peace and security through advocating for peaceful settlements of disputes and inclusive dialogue.
But South Africa enters a deeply divided council, especially on issues like Syria's civil war and the Israeli-Palestinian situation. On the African continent, protracted conflicts continue in South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, problems that Pretoria is keen to address during its time on the council.
We are guided by the resolution of the AU that we shall silence guns by 2020. Only when we have peace and a culture of peace can we have sustainable development. And we in Africa need that most.
Ahead of the vote, South Africa held a reception as a last-minute push to garner support. There was clearly enough to achieve this non-permanent position, but South Africa wants more, to create a permanent position for an African nation, a role it says it's ready to fill. The result was never really in doubt, and now South Africa can begin the work to rejoin the Security Council for the third time in just over a decade. It takes up that position on January the 1st next year. Nick Harper, SABC News, New York.
All right, let's chat to Nick Harper live now from New York. Nick, so you were there. Just tell us what it's like in the General Assembly when these sort of things are announced.
Yeah, a fantastic moment for South Africa, one that was expected, but undoubtedly we saw many celebrations around the General Assembly Hall, in particular from the South African delegation. They were very hopeful going into this. I spoke to the minister last night. She said that she had her fingers crossed, but that she was hopeful for the outcome. They did very well. A huge haul of votes, 183 out of a potential 190. And when those results were read out, even though they were expected, we heard the applause and a little bit of cheering in the background as well. Perhaps the loudest clap, though, when those results were read out was in fact not actually for South Africa, but for Indonesia, because they were running for a seat that was contested. South Africa was running uncontested, but Indonesia was up against the Maldives, who they managed to beat quite convincingly. And at that point, the Indonesian ambassador inside the UN General Assembly Hall looked very happy and started to bow down to the desk before her.
What do we take out of the numbers, Nick? Apparently, under Thabo Mbeki, then president, we received the most amount of votes because this is our third time. Then under Jacob Zuma, a little bit less, I think 182, and now 183. How much can you read into that? To what extent is it a sign of confidence in President Cyril Ramaphosa and the new administration in South Africa?
Well, I think you have to take into consideration the number of countries that were voting. This time round there was 190, so there was only 7 countries that didn't vote for South Africa. On those other two occasions, on one occasion back in 2006, there was just 6 countries that didn't vote for South Africa. On the other occasion, there was 8. So a very, very close thing, only a single vote between those 3 administrations. I'm not sure how much you can read into the new President Ramaphosa, being in charge, and whether the loss of a vote or 2 here or there is any direct result of him being in charge. I think perhaps what it does show, though, is that there is once again overwhelming support for the South Africans at the United Nations. In many ways, they come to the United Nations with no real contentious past. They come with a legacy that shows that they are ready to stand up for human rights, and that they're ready to try and help to provide peaceful solutions when it comes to times of conflicts. So once again, doing very well, getting an overwhelming majority. Not quite a full house, but not far off.
Has anybody raised any issue over our human rights record? Some would say at one stage it was better than it's been in recent years, when we've welcomed very controversial leaders into South Africa.
Well, it hasn't been something that's been very much widely discussed during this election campaign. Minister Sisulu was speaking about the fact that this was an opportunity for South Africa to once again stand up for human rights. She talked about the legacy of Nelson Mandela, and this really being the perfect way to celebrate his centenary year, a way in an international sense to be able to display his legacy and stand up for the human rights and stand up for the minority people that he has on so many other occasions. So I suppose human rights coming up, but in a slightly different format in terms of how that was discussed.
And Nick, you spoke about it in your insert about South Africa wanting reform on the UN Security Council. A lot of countries want reform because we have 5 permanent member states who can veto any decision, and they often work in opposition to each other. But what is the likelihood of Africa ever getting a permanent seat, getting veto power, or changing this setup at all, because they have to vote themselves out?
Well, it is something that South Africa wants, but it's something that South Africa has been wanting for a couple of decades, and they're not the only country that is in that position. Other countries, the likes of India, Japan, Germany, Brazil, they've all talked about trying to get a permanent seat on the council. From South Africa's point of view, at one point they were suggesting 2 permanent South African positions. One, in theory, they would fill, and perhaps the other filled by the likes of Nigeria or Kenya. They say that the Security Council no longer represents the world that it serves, that it was created more than 70 years ago. But here we are in the 21st century, and there is still not an African permanent member on the council. Critics of the idea of introducing more permanent members say, look, we can't even find unity on the council with 5 veto power members. If you increase that and gave more countries the possibility of vetoing resolutions, there is the possibility of even less unity on the council. So yes, it's something that South Africa wants, but remember, those 5 permanent members would need to green light any decision for a new permanent member. They want to hang on to that power, so it seems somewhat unlikely that they would want to go ahead and give any country, South Africa or any other country around the world, an opportunity to get a veto vote power as well.
Unlikely indeed. Thank you very much. Our correspondent in the United States, Nick Harper.
Of course, staying with international news.